if people are introducing people or not, but I'm here. So, and it looks like a lot of us are here. So I'm going to go ahead and get ready since we are on the time. So welcome everyone to my talk, Accessible Patterns from the Ground Up. Digital accessibility can be difficult or frustrating to a lot of people, but it doesn't have to be. By making some small changes to your everyday workflow, you can make a huge impact on making the digital world more inclusive without crushing your creativity or sacrificing your sanity. So in this talk, I'll walk through the process of creating an accessible pattern from design to development while focusing on accessibility best practices and tools at each step. Hi, Mike. And I'll start with a wireframe, process that into design, translate the design into code, and finally we'll test for accessibility. Obviously, on your team, if you have a larger team, you probably wouldn't be doing all of these things, and you'd also be doing these things in a lot more in-depth kind of way. But this is kind of the high-level overview, so then you can take some of these tools and best practices and apply them to your situation. My name is Carrie Fisher. I'm a senior accessibility consultant at DQ. I've been building websites professionally since about early 2000, give or take, with various frameworks. In fact, my first real job as a web developer was taking a website from Drupal 4 to Drupal 6. So, I mean, who knows what happened to 5 there, but no Drupal experience prior to that. They just kind of threw me in the deep end. It was a little bit challenging, but it also introduced me to the amazing community, and I've kind of stuck around for a while. So I am thankful for that difficult project. So since that initial project with Drupal, I've spent the majority of my professional career working as a front-end developer at various Drupal shops in particular. And then I kind of switched on to more UX and accessibility, which led me to DQ. It may not be a name that you're familiar with, but it's very big in the accessibility world. So it's one of the top companies in the world specializing in digital accessibility. And we work with a lot of Fortune 500 companies. We make websites, mobile apps more accessible, educational training, resources, audits, and a suite of tools. You may be familiar with Axe Core, one of our tools. a few of you know who DQ is. Yeah, hi Kat. So today we're going to talk about the process of going from accessible pattern idea to the final product, and we'll chat about the 4 stages as we go through accessibility journey. And for me, that I call it awareness, knowledge, practice, and understanding. And this talk was inspired by the variety of students I've trained in accessibility, and it addresses some of the typical questions I get asked during these more beginner trainings. This talk is tagged as intermediate because I'm going to go through this first part a little bit faster so we can get to more of the meat of the pattern. But if there's anything that is confusing or you want to know more about, you've got all the links now to get a hold of me. And then obviously there's a lot of really great people in the Drupal community that also specialize in accessibility. Like I mentioned earlier, one size does not fit all based on your team's size, budgetary constraint. You may do one piece and then hand it off to another team member or an outside consultant, or you might not need all the tools or steps outlined, and that's okay. It's more important to find something that works for you and your team than just giving up on accessibility altogether. So this talk is meant to help you get that initial internal conversation going. All right, so moving on, this all has kind of a growth farmer kind of aspect to it. As any good farmer knows or gardener knows, before you plant any seeds, you must prep the soil. So let's chat a bit about stage 1, which is accessibility awareness. Before you can fix the problem, you have to realize there is a problem. So this is awareness, right? You're brand new to digital accessibility. You're still trying to understand what it is and how you can implement changes in your daily workflow maybe. Or you may be aware that there's a set of digital accessibility guidelines for developers and designers out there, but you're kind of hazy on what it all kind of means in a more practical, hands-on approach sense. So again, if you're new to the field of accessibility, the following slides will help you give you a deeper foundation before we go into the pattern workflow. But if you're less new, like some of us here, you might know some of this already, but it's kind of important to just kind of do this really quick review so we're all on the same page. Digital accessibility, sometimes abbreviated A11Y, also called ALLY sometimes. It's about designing and building your digital offerings in such a way that regardless of a person's mental or physical ability, they can still interact with your website, app, or electronic document in a meaningful and equal way. According to the World Health Organization, we estimate about 1 billion, or 15% of the world's population, self-identify as having a disability. And of course, that original number is, I think, a little bit deceiving, because if you consider people who don't identify as having a disability, but who could benefit from accessible websites and apps, that number jumps way up higher. For example, people who are temporarily disabled, like a broken wrist, or situationally disabled, glare on a device screen. I think we've all been there, at least. Mildly disabled, right? Some people who are considered disabled, like hard of hearing, or maybe you're colorblind, but you would never check that box for feeling like on a census like being disabled. Or even seeing English as a second language, or whatever content that you're reading that is your not primary language. So you might need a little bit more time to process the content. This part always reminds me of Helena, shout out to her, but she's always talking about like this. If you're talking about the US alone, you have 56.7 million. So she likes to talk about it as the entire population of California plus New York together. And you'd never build like a website or an app and say, oh yeah, everyone can use this except for California and New York. And I feel like that's so powerful because, you know, it kind of puts a little bit more tangent on this huge number. 56 million is kind of a hard number to wrap your head around. But if we're talking about globally, 39.6 people, 65 and older, who could benefit from accessible websites due to loss of hearing, eyesight, motor control, decreased cognition. And again, this going into that kind of state idea, that would be equivalent to Texas plus Illinois, so about 38 million there. Of course, this number is expected to double in 20 years. As we keep getting older, we're living longer, and technology is becoming even more prevalent and important in our daily lives. My generation is one of the ones that knew life before technology had invaded it to the level it is now, and will be probably some of the older generation that's lived that kind of gamut from nothing to everything. So it's kind of a really interesting idea of how that progresses as we age, and user experience, and like how that really plays into it. So in total, we're talking about 96 million, or 32% of the population. We're talking only US here. So if you're ignoring this collective demographic, you're losing up to 32% of your potential users just by those simple numbers. And a lot of people understand those numbers, but I think this is a number that a lot of people don't get to hear about. But people with disabilities in the US control over $1 trillion and have over 200 billion to spend as they see fit, like discretionary. They don't have to pay like the rent or utilities and that sort of thing. So long story short, if your company is spending lots of money on things like SEO or marketing, but not addressing accessibility needs of their users, they're missing out on both the huge numbers of users and their money. All right, so those are rough numbers on people who could benefit from accessible websites, apps, the money they can spend. But what about regulations related to accessibility? And this one I'll kind of gloss over about. But there is this thing called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. I call it WCAG, some people call it WCAG, WCAG, I've heard it all. Whatever you call it, these regulations were developed by the W3C process in cooperation with individuals and organizations around the world, with the goal of providing single shared standard of web content accessibility that meets the needs of individuals, organizations, and governments internationally. These guidelines are helpers, right? I think a lot of people read these specs and really get into the nitty-gritty, which is great. But on a practical sense, they're really aids to help designers and developers create accessible websites and apps with people in mind. It gets technical really fast. So for beginners, we try to focus on the actionable parts of the guidelines or the core concepts. So we're talking about perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So if you hear the acronym POUR, that's what that means. And it's not about rigidly adhering to the hard and fast rules like I just talked about with WCAG, but it's about understanding and meeting the needs of individuals. So I like this visual here that I created here to think about the interconnection of these POUR elements, because again, we kind of see them individual, but they're really symbiotic. It's like a relationship. And so it's secular and, kind of each one feeds into the other. So a little bit quicker here, the category is poor, perceivable, making sure that users can perceive the information being presented. So I might ask something like, is there anything on our website or app that a person with a disability cannot perceive? Would this work for visual, mobility, hearing, cognitive speech, right? So an example would be like adding text alternatives to non-decorative images, or adding captions and transcripts to videos, making sure the color is not the only method to convey meaning. Those would be kind of examples of perceivable. The second category is operable. So users must be able to operate the interface. So I'm asking questions like, can the users control the interactive elements on our web or app? So a lot of times interactivity might have to do with JavaScript a lot of times. So I'm testing for things like keyboard traps, modals, that sort of thing. So I want to make sure that using my keyboard only, that I can, like I said, go through a modal or go through a slideshow, making sure I have enough time to fill out a form and that sort of thing. So the third one's understandable. You want to make sure that that things are understandable. The information is well written, the operation makes sense, right? Is the content, our operation cannot be beyond understanding, essentially. So I'm asking, again, questions about content written clearly. Does the page order make sense? So again, why would I write something that complex or an acronym but not explain what it is? We want to make sure we do those kind of things, and also making sure that things are predictable. So like your main navigation looks one way on one page, and then all of a sudden it looks completely different. And you're not going to a new section, it's just like one different page. That's one of those things that would fall under understandable. And then the last one is robust. So this one's kind of a tricky one. It means that users must have access to content as technology advances. So this is one that's sort of like related to SEO in the sense that your accessibility work is never done. So the questions I'm asking things like, does my website or app only support the newest browser? Or can it work on IE6, right? Or at least that's what we used to say. We're a little bit better now about that, about how far you go back. But thinking about best practices, does this both work in landscape and portrait? So yeah, this one's a tricky one because it's like, again, like the SEO thing where you're continually testing, retesting, things come out that are new AT devices, so assistive technology devices. So all the time, robust, robust, robust. So again, the underlying spirit isn't about rigidity to adhering to hard and fast rules, but it's about understanding the diverse needs of your users. So once you're on board with that, following the guidelines from WCAG become more of a roadmap than a to-do list. All right, so I covered some of the basics about the number of people needing accessible websites and apps, obviously a large amount of money that's kind of being, it's out there for the taking for the people who are interested in that. An international set of rules that have been thought out very well, people in the mind. So now I'm on to the stage 2. So awareness was stage 1, stage 2 is knowledge. So at this stage, you're kind of aware of digital inequality at some level, and you kind of maybe know a little bit about some of the regulations like WCAG or POR principles. But what else can you do to help make your designs and your code more inclusive? Before you even pick up your pencil or open up your digital design program of choice, you need to keep a couple things in mind. First up, accessibility heuristics. And the question I get asked sometimes is, what are accessibility heuristics? Accessibility specific rules of thumb. Again, these are inspired by WCAG, and they're built for the purpose of evaluating design assets for accessibility. So these rules help designers integrate accessibility considerations into their work. This particular list was developed by Denis Boudreau over here at DQ and a few other people. And this is a checklist that is available for you. The 2019 is the latest version. So that can be either found in that resources link on the noticed. So you just scroll down to the bottom of the page for those resources, or you can pop in this one, this bit.ly over here. But what this does is essentially, it's got kind of a two-part to it. Like the first part you can see is this like dark blue one. And it's asking some of those questions. It's sort of, again, thinking about POR in the sense of, questions like, is this information conveyed by means other than just color? is the foreground background contrast ratio at least 4.5 to 1 or 3.1 for large text. So making sure that design is exempt of images with embedded text, making sure line spacing, paragraph spacing, typography, right? Any of the things that you would think of it from a design level. Are the selected typefaces easy to read, or do they render properly on mobile? So that's another thing to consider as well. I think all of us at this point know about rems and ems and percentages and thinking about that. And that's really important for accessibility from typography standpoint, right? So you want to be able to blow things up and not lose that kind of resolution. And you want them all to be related throughout the page. So, you know, there's a lot of different, little different options there. And then the second part is behind that, you can see this kind of white, and it's like more of a checklist. So it's going to ask you these questions like that I just kind of gave you a few examples of, but it'll have ways to rate it. So it's beyond, like maybe you're doing like the very best you can do. Positive, meaning that you would pass like a WCAG assessment if someone came in and looked at your site. Negative is a fail. So you would fail on that kind of assessment or not applicable. So there are things that, you know, let's say you don't have a media player, for instance. So those you'd be exempt from on an assessment. All right, so beyond heuristics, we also talk about personas. Helena and I actually did one last year at at DCon, all about personas, and that was a lot of fun because we got some hands-on interaction with people. Unfortunately, we're virtual this year, so we can't do something like that, but that was a lot of fun for people who happen to be there. But for personas, we're asking questions like, who are we designing and developing for? And they can help align strategy and goals to specific user groups. So a user persona can be formal or informal, on paper, or, you know, just in your head. It is important when planning a new website or app to keep these kind of people of varying backgrounds, like you're thinking ethnicities, genders, ages, technical abilities, and also disabilities as part of your personas. So you're working towards meeting a more realistic variety of perspectives and needs, so more representative of the real world. The purpose of personas is to create reliable and realistic representations of your key audience segments for reference. So these representations should be based on qualitative and some quantitative user research if you have them. Web analytics whenever possible. So go ahead and look into your Google Analytics and see who is coming to your site. There's certain things obviously you won't be able to know, but you can have a little bit of deduction. Personas help focus decisions surrounding site components and adding that real world layer and consideration to the conversation. A quick note about personas, they're kind of a double-edged sword, right? They are not based on real people or stereotypes. There's not a substitute for user testing. They're not useful if you make them and then your developers and your designers ignore them. So they're something you want to share within the team and all be on the same page. Personas usually, and they should be, based on real user data if you have it, supported again by everybody and communicated early and often. So really think of this as a tool set to help create empathy and a better understanding of your users. These are on GitHub. We can get that link again, or you find that in the resources below. But this is the UK Home Offices. And we use these a lot in training because they kind of get people to start thinking about the different ways people look at your site. So they're really kind of useful. I see some stuff about slides. Let me know if I need to reset anything or if it's just an individual. All right, so that was the stage 2 for design. So now armed with some more accessibility design knowledge, move on to stage 3, which is practice. We're feeling more confident about knowledge of digital accessibility rules and best practices, and you can help build that knowledge into your design process. So just for some reference, about 15 years ago, the word usability was a big buzzword for teams to strive for in the design side. But nobody really says, make it usable today. Now, that's just what you do. This UX principle or discipline doesn't think about making sure something is usable anymore because it's intrinsic. So that's what we're striving for now with accessibility, right? Learning to design accessibly is habitually the same as learning to design usably, is that incorporating both heuristics that we just talked about and the personas, and a lot of different other methods that you could from user experience point of view, and kind of grow that over time. So again, I always tell people to, pick one thing that you want to focus on, and then you build it into your workflow. And then the next time you don't really think about that first thing, and then you can build something else. That's true for code or design. I talk about that a lot, about how, again, people who were designing and coding before mobile was like a big thing, we had to relearn and really remap our brains when we talked about how we are going to design and develop, because it used to just be one set, pixel height, pixel width, no variability. Device will always be like a computer, a desktop computer. There was no laptops, right? I'm sounding really old all of a sudden, but the point is that when mobile came in, we all had to kind of retrain ourselves and think about this from different approaches. And so it was hard at first and slow at first, but eventually we got to the point where I challenge one of you guys, any of you, to design or develop anything that's not responsive now. It's hard. It's hard to go backwards and to think about something that is just so intrinsic and something that we just take for granted now. It's just part of our workflow. And to take that away, right? And maybe I would make it a lot faster now, but it's the same thing with accessibility, right? It's this whole idea of like building on one thing at a time, and eventually just becomes, part of your gig. All right, and so UX design process, we have the lo-fi and the hi-fi. So we're going to kind of see examples of that. So here's a pattern design. Today we're going to be building an image card that flips when you click it. You've probably seen things like this before in the wild. We're going to be using a modified annotation symbol. These are from Jack Nicolai from Adobe. So those are out in the wild, and you can create them and put them in like any of the Adobe products. Obviously, this is going to work in. And then our person, internal designer and UX person, Aaron Perlman, he's our lead designer here at DQ. He made some modifications for our internal needs. So we're going to have things like symbols B and L in the red teardrops, so button and link. The green comment bubble adds specific accessibility information like accessible names, and things like the blue square symbol indicate tab order. So we'll look at that a little bit. So here's the lo-fi flip image card without annotations. So on the left, you can see what our key is, and on the right is just kind of something simple. And I'm looking up because I have two screens and I can see it better on this one. So then this next one we have, it's marked up, right? So you see some things that are typical in a wireframe kind of situation where you'd have maybe pixel sizes, or maybe if you had content, right? Or that sort of thing. So that kind of normal kind of looking things. And then we have these additional accessibility annotations. So we're telling them things like, okay, this image is here and it's also going to be decorative. So that sends a signal to the developer, hey, I know that I'm not going to need an alt field, or I need an empty alt field in this particular case, right? There's some things that are kind of triggering things, or this is a heading, right? So I'm thinking, okay, what level of heading do I want to have, right? And then we have things like the access name. So the access name is the accessible name. It's just shortened here. So what is it that we're going to call this? What are we going to put into the accessibility API that screen readers are going to hear when they encounter this? And then we have this thing called the tab stop rate, where we have this one that's A, it's for alpha. So alpha is, where is your initial focus going to be? And anyone working, especially with JavaScript, you're always thinking about your focus, right? Where is the focus indicator going to go? So that is good, obviously, for people who are using screen readers and other AT devices. But it's also for your keyboard-only users, right? What are they going to be tabbed on? Where is their focus going to go first, right? And so you're always kind of thinking about these kind of things as well. So normal stuff that you normally see in a lo-fi sort of situation with design, but just adding a little bit of an accessibility layer on there as well. So again, this is a lo-fi. It's a little bit more, maybe it's a medium-fi here. Outside the normal things you're watching for as your designs move through development, there's a couple accessibility-centric things. So colored font. So we're talking about contrast, type size, type weight, focuses. We talked about that a little bit, but Z-indexing, spacing, custom focuses that we're going to have designed for, not just relying on the browser to build those for us. Tab order should be correct, and it should be It's usually, depending on your functionality, but it's usually top to bottom, left to right, just as we read a page, right? So you wouldn't want your tab to start at the top, go to the bottom, and then come back. Same thing with even if you're building just a component. You want it to make sense. And then, of course, the accessible names or accessible alts, or if we have alt text for an image. In this particular case, we know this image is decorative, so we don't necessarily need an alt in this particular case. All right. And again, all of these are some of the tools that I use when I'm helping with designs or accessible designs. And so I've got those again in the resources list. I won't name them all here, but just keeping in mind that especially some of the simulators and emulators, so Chrome Lens, No Coffee, and Funkify, those are all simulating different disabilities. And so you have to keep in the back of your mind that that's not about an individual, right? It's a representation, and it's also more of a tool for empathy building. So maybe it's to help sell your accessibility needs to maybe the manager of or your client that you're talking to or something like that. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. You don't want it to be like a one-to-one kind of situation, or say all people with this disability encounter a site and this is how they experience it. No, please don't do that. Please don't do that. But all the other ones are just either tools that you can help with color contrast, or the posters that I talked about, and other things like that. WCAG obviously is a big one too. All right, so now it's time for the design team to hand off their mock-ups to the front-end developers, or if you have UX developers sometimes, or engineers. Depending on the number of people and types of roles you have at your office, this workflow might look a little bit different, but at some point, basically, the design needs to be translated into code. This is where I would always get excited to get the mocks from the designers especially. And by sharing these design and wireframes with the dev team as soon as possible, and creating the lists of assets needed for each component, that helps the developers kind of understand and kind of build it in their mind, what is expected from them from their pattern, allows them to think about potential technical and accessibility issues, right, more deeply and earlier. So the design handoff and the engineers, developers are kind of like the stage 2 knowledge, and it'll get to that stage 3 of practice once the pattern is turned into code. So just quickly, here are some additional links or guides and libraries that we look at. I helped build I kind of built the accessibility style guide, so I listed that first. But there's a lot of different component libraries out there that are even more robust and updated, probably even more. At the time when I built mine, there was not a lot of options out there. So check out the other ones first, maybe, and then go to back to that one. But these kind of are kind of giving you, just like, you do a search for a pattern and you'd find it on, I don't know, like some random website, right? I don't want to call anyone out, but it may be good. Maybe it's not, like a code pen or something. But for accessibility purposes, there's certain places that I would trust to look first besides the WCAG. A lot of JavaScript frameworks, if you're building something that's decoupled or something with Gatsby or React or something, there's a lot of specific ones as well for that. So again, depending on what you're exactly looking for, this is a good kind of idea. So we have this idea of this flip card. Maybe I'd search some of these guides or libraries first to see what I could find. And so usually what I do, and what most people I think did as front-end developers, is you find a pattern that's almost there, or kind of like almost what you want, and then you can make it work to what you want. And that's the same is true with accessibility. So it might not have all the things that you need right out of the gate, but you can get it and use it as kind of the framework to build your accessibility best practices on. So in this particular case, we're adding, let's see, oh, there it is. The ID right here, the button ID is flip4, and I have the ARIA controls for content here. I have an ARIA expanded false. I have got an ID of content. So I have different places where I can connect my ARIA and what it should do in different places. Here I have the alt is equal to null, so that's not an empty alt, but it's an empty alt, not a missing alt. So that again signifies to the AT users, this is just decorative, ignore this kind of thing. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. Here's a little snippet of the JavaScript that is doing it. I'm going through it because you have access to this as well and the resources. So again, practice for devs, stage 3 for devs. The knowledge part was, the guides and the libraries, and then what do you do with it, right? So these things, these resources I find really valuable because they help bridge that gap between the theory and the reality, right? So you have the accessibility project, which is great, ARIA specs, at least Slack and Twitter. If you're not already on that main W3C Slack channel, let me know. It's invite only now, only because we got spammers a few years ago, but there's thousands of people, and there's a Drupal channel, and there's all kinds of other channels that are in there. So pretty much anything that you have questions about, people are there to answer. So I can't say anything more highly about it than that if you're interested in this kind of topic. And obviously Twitter, there's a lot of people there as well. Quick reference guides by the WCAG are actually really good too. They've got a lot of patterns, but they also go into depth of why, of the why. All right, so now we've tilled the soil, we planted and watered the seeds, and we let some light in, so we're done growing our accessible component, right? Well, almost. If your garden is intended to, just like your components, weeds creep in and take over. So I know a lot of people don't like to weed a garden, but it's a necessary task. Otherwise, your flowers will die. Similarly, accessibility audits and testing are not super glamorous, but they're very necessary. So it's just like weeding. It's just one of those things. It's not a one and done activity. You don't weed one time and then you're done for the whole season. Accessibility testing is exactly the same. It's never done. You have new updates to browsers, assistive technology devices are updated all the time, markup rules, code regressions, et cetera, et cetera. So you should consider accessibility testing as an ongoing maintenance task. So you need to make sure you set aside time each month or each sprint or something to review the accessibility of whatever you're working on. That way you can catch your mistakes when they're small and easy to manage or fix. Accessibility. So again, I work for a company that makes a lot of their money off of tools, right? Besides Axe Core that you see, there's a lot of different tools that we sell to people. I'm not going to talk about them because I'm not one of those people that does that, or I don't market. But point is that everyone wants to automate everything. Same for our company. We want to do it. Someday we want accessibility to be one of those things you press a button and then it just does it. I say we summon magical creatures and they can go in, they find and fix all of the issues. But unfortunately, that regardless of the tool that you're using right now, that kind of automatic testing can only reliably pick up 30 to 40% of your issues. And some tools are better at picking up some issues than others. So you have to use a suite of tools on top of that. The issues the automatic testing tools do find, many still require a human to interpret the results and prioritize the issues. A big example I see all the time, automated tool tells you that your image is missing alternative text, but it can't tell you what the alternative text is to write. And so it just kind of gets exhausting. But of course, it's not all bad news. The good news is that automated testing tools are truly amazing and getting smarter with each new version. Again, shout out to some products that are out there that are getting smarter and smarter. I'm hoping someday there'll be a tool that we can, get closer and closer to that 100%, a mythical 100%. But until then, you can add those UX, UI tests, manual keyboard tests, mobile touch tests, screen reader tests, and other ATs. Don't forget about the other ATs that are out there. So that could be speech to text, that could be some Braille device that you're using, right? There's a lot of different ATs beyond screen readers, so keep that in the back of your mind as well. Content readability tests. Readability, there's a lot of free ones that are out there, Hemingway, Grammarly, the readability tools, there's a bunch that are out there that can tell you, the gaps that you have in your content. But last but not least, I think user tests are the most important to consider for your workflow. They're not necessarily the cheapest or the fastest, but they are the most robust and the deepest that kind of feedback that you'll get. So think about that too, and some opportunities for getting that into your workflow. And one really quick thing to do, don't forget about an accessibility statement or an accessible way for your users to contact you. We had a client once who did not have a statement, of course, but then they also had an inaccessible content contact us form. So they couldn't even report when they did have an issue. So just kind of, that's a pretty low bar kind of idea. So if you only take one thing away, go out right now, test your form, and add an accessibility statement. Here's a quick little demo of the actual thing in the pattern in live. I'm going to do a screen reader. I'm going to undo my mic here. Let me know if you can hear us. Oh, it's not talking, but we can see the, yeah, for some reason it's not picking it up. So we can hear the, oh, I'm going to pop it. I know what it is, sir. Sorry, let me get my sound on the right one. Live demo. My sound's going into the Yeti, so it's not, let's do display audio. Let's see if that one works. Visitor, can you hear that now? Click card. You are currently on the heading level 2. True or false? Slopes are carnivores. Technology. You are currently on a button. To click this button, press Control Options. True or false? Slopes are carnivores. False. Slopes mainly eat the tree buds, new shoots, fruit and leaves of the Cecropia tree. Expanded button. True or false? Slopes are carnivores. Collapse button. True or false? Slopes live in trees. True or false? Slopes live in trees. All right. I won't do that the whole time because that might be annoying. But the point is that this card does exist. Hopefully you guys, yeah, and this is slopes. There is a fun kind of thing. You can teach your screen reader to read a specific dialect or a certain word because like DQ always gets picked up as deek. And so you can change it to make it sound a little bit more like your actual company name if you've got an interesting company name or unusual one that the ATs don't like. So again, some of the things that I would recommend for testing: automatic testing tools, keyboard touch devices. We talked about some screen readers. Combinations of screen readers are really important too. So these are kind of the ones I'm leaving you here with: Windows, Chrome, Firefox plus NVDA. NVDA is edging out JAWS only because JAWS is expensive, and NVDA is just as good in most cases. That's kind of the gold standard. So if you have a Mac like I do, you need to get yourself a virtual machine or a dedicated machine, or someone on your team who's doing that kind of testing should have that. Just like, again, hardware and software goes together. So Safari plus VoiceOver for Android's Chrome, or Firefox plus TalkBack, and for Safari VoiceOver. And again, web developer toolbar, content readability test, that sort of thing. Kind of fun fact as well, Safari VoiceOver on iOS is better than Safari VoiceOver on Mac desktop. Who knows? Different teams, I suppose, different constraints. But so now we're at the full bloom. We're kind of running out of time, so I'll go a little bit faster here at the end, but we're almost done. As we discussed, there are 4 different stages. So the last stage is understanding. So we've discussed the different stage of digital accessibility that we're all on. So true beginners might not even be to stage 1. But I am finding that group rarer and rarer. So now we're more on stage 2, knowledge, and stage 3, which is practice. So you're aware of digital accessibility guidelines, maybe you know a few testing tools, but you don't quite understand, and you haven't really quite connected these dots to the humans they impact. From the standpoint of getting stuff done, I was at stage 2 and 3 for years and years and years. And so they're okay stopping points for getting your job done. But I have to kind of challenge you a little bit. So what happens when things that you need are too complex for a quick fix, or you don't have buy-in from your peers or your management? I feel like when we all kind of collectively get to this stage 4 of understanding and really like getting to why these changes are needed, people will be more motivated to make those changes regardless of the challenges that are involved. So I think that's when this true change of accessibility in the digital sphere will happen. I love this quote. So we'll end this one with this: the power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect. So I'm hoping that we get there soon. And I think that this is one way to get it. So hopefully you learned a few things and you can apply that into your workflow, one pattern at a time. Awesome. Yep, and lots of links. So I'm just looking here. I kind of ended a few minutes for early in case anyone had any questions or I missed one along the way. It's nice to see all your faces. Virtually, of course, yeah. Nice. All right. Well, thank you all for attending. If you have any other questions, you know where to find me. I believe that this is recorded somewhere. And I apologize, someone did come to my door in the middle of the presentation. I could hear my dogs barking in the background. Hopefully they didn't distract you all too much.